My name is Paula Kensington. I'm 29, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the other child in my own family story. Not the disaster, not the rebel, just the one they quietly stepped around while they built a pedestal for my sister. She was the golden child. New car at 18, college paid for without a second thought, rent covered so she could focus on herself. I learned early that my future was something I was supposed to fund alone. When she sneezed, everyone rushed. When I hit a milestone, it barely registered. I told myself it didn't matter. I worked, I saved, I built a life that had nothing to do with their approval. But favoritism doesn't just feel unfair, it spreads. It seeps into every holiday until all you can see is who mattered and who never did. By the time this Christmas rolled around, I was done pretending otherwise. My sister sat at the end of the table, glowing like a spotlight built for her. My brother kept things light by taking shots at me, one joke after another, until he finally leaned back and said some people just weren't born to succeed. My parents didn't stop him. They smiled. 5 minutes later, my attorney stepped through my parents' front door with a folder under his arm. He introduced himself, opened it, and started reading. By the time he finished the first line, my mother's plate hit the floor, and my brother's face had lost every trace of color. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. The way that night cracked my family open didn't start with the folder on the table. It started years earlier, in that same old house upstate where everything looked cozy from the outside and lopsided from the inside. I am the youngest of 3. My older sister Bianca arrived first and immediately became the benchmark for what a Kensington was supposed to be. My brother Trevor came next and learned quickly that staying close to her was the safest place to stand. By the time I showed up, the roles were already assigned. She was the bright future, he was the charming backup plan, and I was the kid who filled the extra chair. Mom and Dad would never say it out loud. But the hierarchy was obvious. When Bianca brought home another honor roll certificate, it went straight onto the fridge and stayed there for months. When I brought home a solid report card after working evenings at a diner, it lived under a pile of unopened mail until I quietly threw it away. It was the same with money. When Bianca turned 18, there was a small family gathering and a set of car keys she didn't have to earn. Driving lessons, insurance, gas cards, all handled as if the universe owed her safe passage. When it was my turn, the car was suddenly a luxury, not a necessity. I was told that buses existed for a reason and that learning to stand on my own 2 feet was the best gift they could give me. College followed the same script. Bianca's tuition and off-campus rent appeared without visible effort. Mine came with loan documents, interest rates, and the understanding that asking for help meant I had failed some invisible test. No one said I couldn't go. They just made sure I knew I would be going alone. By the time I was in my 20s, I had stopped hoping for fairness and started building my life as if I had no family safety net at all. I worked 2 jobs, studied at night, and taught myself to manage money better than most people my age. While Bianca floated through internships that didn't seem to require an actual paycheck, I learned what overdue notices looked like and how far a single salary could stretch when there was no one to call. Back home, the narrative never shifted. Holidays were a stage for Bianca's updates, for long stories about her potential and how proud everyone was of what she might do someday. Trevor added his own running commentary to keep the spotlight from wandering. My role was to listen, nod, and be grateful that they remembered to ask if I was taking any time off work. There was one area where our paths crossed more than they realized. Dad ran a small home health agency, the kind of business that survives on clean records and the goodwill of a town that talks. When I was in high school, he started asking me to help in the office during breaks. At first, it was simple filing, then reconciling schedules, then double-checking billing codes. He called it busy work, but it taught me more about his world than he ever intended. I noticed which clients paid on time and which insurers stalled, how thin the margins really were, how much depended on forms being filled out exactly right. I saw letters from regulators and the quiet tension when one of them mentioned an audit window. I knew the agency wasn't falling apart, but it wasn't as unshakable as they told people at barbecues and church events. They preferred the story where Patrick Kensington knew exactly what he was doing and nothing important ever slipped. Years moved on without anyone admitting what was obvious. Bianca was still the honored success story, Trevor still played the easygoing son, and my parents still treated my independence like a quirk instead of a strength. Underneath all of that, though, the numbers in Dad's office began to look more strained. Schedules tightened. Vendors waited longer to be paid. The stack of envelopes marked urgent stopped disappearing and started occupying a permanent place on his desk. I wasn't supposed to see any of that. I was supposed to stay in my lane, show up when invited, and trust that the people at the head of the table had everything under control. But once you have spent years being treated like an afterthought, you learn to read the room more carefully than anyone else. When I finally moved out, it was to an apartment over a laundromat. It wasn't impressive, but every bill had my name on it and every piece of furniture was something I had paid for myself. I took a job in medical billing. People called it boring paperwork. To me, it felt familiar. It used the same codes from Dad's office and the same rules he treated like background noise. I still went home for holidays because it was easier than explaining why I might not. Each time I came back, the cracks in their version of reality were clearer. The agency sounded respectable around town, but at night I would catch my father staring at the envelopes on the hall table, as if he could push their due dates away by looking at them. The first real shift in our family story did not happen at Christmas. It started with a message from my father that did not sound like him. He almost never called me about anything serious. Our contact was usually limited to holidays and quick check-ins. That week, he left a voicemail asking if I could come by the house because he wanted to discuss an opportunity with the agency. His tone was tight in a way I recognized from the nights he stared at unpaid bills. I went after work. At the old house in upstate New York, the dining room did not look like it usually did. The table where Bianca's awards used to be displayed was covered with past due notices, aging invoices, and a letter from a state office reminding him about documentation he had ignored for too long. He downplayed it, calling it a temporary squeeze, a simple gap between payments and reimbursements. He did not ask about my life or my work. He asked if I knew anyone who understood healthcare money well enough to lend quickly without panicking. He said banks were slow, that outside investors wanted too much control, that he just needed someone on our side to tide the agency over. I took a small stack of statements home with me. At my kitchen table, I laid them out and did the math. The problem was not a single bad month. It was years of undercharging, careless follow-up, and growing attention from regulators who did not accept excuses. The numbers told a story he would never say out loud. The business holding up my family's image was running out of room to drift. Part of me wanted to push it away. They had never stepped in for me when I was drowning in tuition and rent. Another part of me saw something different. My father needed help that I was uniquely qualified to understand. I worked in medical billing. I knew the codes, the delays, the way claims aged out. A random lender would either walk away or attach terms that would finish what his decisions had started. I called a lawyer instead of calling him back. His name was Victor Ames. I had seen it in the letterhead on contracts in my father's office when I was younger, but we had never spoken directly. Sitting in his office as a client felt like stepping into a world where my knowledge actually counted. I kept my explanation to facts: balances owed, notices received, my own position, and the way my parents still treated the agency like something too sacred to fail. Victor listened, filled a legal pad with notes, and then told me something I already half knew. If I wanted to help, I had to do it as a lender, not as a daughter handing over a check and hoping gratitude would keep the terms honest. Families bend memories. Contracts do not. He suggested a structure that made sense even outside of the family context. I could extend financing through a formal note, secured by the agency's receivables and backed by a pledge of my father's ownership interest. The agreement would require regular reporting and limit new borrowing. If he ignored those obligations, a default clause would shift voting control to me. It was not a trap. It was protection any serious lender would demand from a struggling business. Before anything moved forward, Victor brought in a forensic accountant he trusted, a woman named Sonia Patel. Her job was to verify that the agency could recover if someone disciplined its finances instead of just reshuffling them. She reviewed claims, reimbursements, vendor ledgers, and payroll. Her conclusion was blunt, but hopeful. With oversight, the business could stabilize. Without it, it would keep sliding until someone else took it apart. I left that meeting with a folder of draft terms and a feeling I had not had around my family before. Leverage built on competence, not manipulation. For once, I was not begging to be taken seriously. I was deciding whether to let them borrow against the stability I had created for myself. When the documents were finished, Victor walked me through every paragraph. I asked about each protection clause, reporting requirement, and trigger that would transfer control if my father chose image over numbers. Nothing about it was hidden. If he read the papers, he would see what signing meant. Only then did I return his call and say there might be a way forward. He came to Victor's office one afternoon a few weeks before Christmas. I watched him flip through the pages, skimming sections that had taken hours to draft. He signed as if the ink itself were the solution. I read every line again before I picked up the pen. When we walked out, he believed he had secured a lifeline that would keep the agency in his hands. I knew I had drawn a boundary that recognized the cost of letting his decisions drag me down with him. By the time December came back around, the rules inside that house had shifted, even if no one else knew it. I drove up the long, icy road to my parents' place, with the kind of steady calm that only arrives after you have already decided what you are willing to live with. The stone chimney, the porch light, the familiar front door were all exactly the same, but the balance between us was not. For once, I walked in with something they needed and could not easily ignore. Inside, Christmas had been arranged like a performance. The good plates were out, candles matched the napkins, and the tree sat in perfect view of the front window, as if the whole town needed to see how well we were doing. Bianca took the end of the table nearest the tree as if it were an assigned seat. Trevor drifted between the kitchen and the dining room, tossing comments over his shoulder just loud enough for everyone to hear. Mom greeted me with polished warmth, the kind she used when guests were watching. Dad barely looked away from his phone. He only put it down when the conversation turned toward the agency and someone asked how business was going. He gave the same confident answer he always did. Things were fine. Better than fine. Just a little seasonal pressure. No one challenged him. I sat halfway down the table, close enough to be included but far enough that no one had to look directly at me while they ran through their usual script. Bianca shared updates about her life in the city. Trevor filled the gaps with easy jokes about people who could not keep up. At one point, he glanced down the table toward me and let out a short laugh like he had just remembered I was there. He said he admired how some people could keep grinding away at small things without ever expecting to really go anywhere with them. The words were light. The intent was not. My parents smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it fit the story they preferred to tell about me. I felt the sting, noticed it, and let it pass. The only clock I paid attention to was inside my head. Victor and I had agreed on a time. The documents were signed and recorded. The notice had gone out. Tonight was not about asking my family to understand anything. It was about putting the truth on the table in a form that could not be softened or spun. Dessert plates had just been set down when the doorbell cut through the noise from the dining room. Mom frowned, surprised. She was not expecting anyone else. She pushed back her chair, wiped her hands on a towel, and moved toward the hallway. I stayed where I was. A moment later, I heard Victor's voice, polite and steady. When he stepped into the doorway of the dining room, the conversation froze. He did not belong to their version of family gatherings. He belonged to mine. Dad straightened in his chair, irritated that a stranger had stepped into his space without invitation. Mom's eyes flicked from his briefcase to my face, putting pieces together faster than she wanted to. Bianca looked annoyed at the interruption. Trevor looked entertained. Victor greeted my parents by name and said he was there on behalf of the secured lender to Kensington Home Health Services. He opened the folder and began to read the notice of default. It laid out the missed reporting deadlines, the unapproved borrowing, the accounts that had been pledged and then put at risk. It named my father as the responsible officer. It named me as the holder of the note. The words were dry on the page, but they landed with weight. Years of quiet imbalance condensed into a few lines of legal language. My parents had taught me that feelings were optional. Signature blocks were not. The document moved through its clauses with no extra drama, each sentence cutting away another piece of the illusion that the agency was untouchable. By the time Victor reached the section about control, no one at the table was pretending to eat. The notice stated that, because of repeated breaches and failure to cure them, voting control under the agreement transferred to the secured party. Effective immediately, any major decision about ownership or operations would now require my consent. He finished reading and looked up. No one spoke. The only sound in the room came from the heater and the clock on the wall. My father was the first to move. His hand closed around the edge of the table hard enough to make the glasses tremble. He stared at Victor, then at me, trying to reorder the evening back into something familiar. For once, there was nothing he could say that would rewrite what had just been read into the record of his own home. Fallout from that evening did not land all at once. It arrived in small, sharp pieces over the next few days, quiet enough that anyone less used to reading between the lines might have brushed them off as background noise. The first piece was a message from one of our longest-serving nurses. Her voicemail was polite but strained. Families were asking if the agency was being sold, if new owners were coming in, if their home visits would suddenly change. She said no one wanted to be blindsided and ended by asking who she should list as the person making final decisions. That same question started to surface in other corners. A coordinator at the hospital delayed a planning meeting without offering a new date. A physician's office that usually called back by the end of the day left my messages unanswered until the week had nearly passed. When they finally responded, the tone was cautious. They talked about stability, about long-term relationships, about how difficult it was to navigate family situations in business. They did not accuse me of anything directly, but they did not have to. What struck me was how quickly people seemed to know a rough outline of what had happened without knowing any of the details that mattered. Someone was already filling in those blanks for them. In a town where my parents' last name carried weight, silence did not protect me. It gave the loudest person in the room permission to define the story on my behalf. Pressure shifted from rumor to something weightier when an envelope from a state office arrived on my desk. It referenced an anonymous complaint about the agency's new leadership, raising questions about conflicts of interest and whether funds were being managed responsibly under recent changes. The wording was careful and neutral, but every line pointed away from the history that had created the problem and toward the person who had just stepped in to fix it. I brought the letter to Victor. He read it twice, set it back on the table, and explained that regulators do not need much of a reason to look harder at a home health provider that has already flirted with late filings. From their point of view, leadership changes, financing arrangements, and a stressed balance sheet were enough to justify closer attention. Even so, he agreed that someone had clearly decided to make sure that attention landed directly on me. Victor asked Sonia to widen the scope of her review. While I stayed at the agency trying to keep visits on schedule and reassure staff, she pulled call logs and email headers in addition to the financial data. She was not interested in the emotional content of the messages. She was mapping contact points, who reached out, to whom, and in what order after the notice was read. Patterns formed quickly. A cluster of calls from my father's personal phone to key referral sources appeared within 2 days of Christmas. Messages from his account followed, describing the change in control as a technical misunderstanding driven by an overconfident family member who did not appreciate how delicate the agency's relationships were. The language never named me, but it quietly invited people to wonder whether I was jeopardizing what he had built. Deeper in the records, Sonia found something I had suspected but had not wanted confirmed. Late-night messages had been sent from Bianca's apartment to general inboxes at licensing and consumer protection offices. She presented herself as a concerned relative, outlined specific worries about an inexperienced operator making aggressive decisions, and described internal practices in enough detail that anyone reading her notes would understand that the person in question now held formal authority. By the time Sonia finished walking me through her timeline, the effect inside the agency was visible. One distributor shortened payment terms without warning. Another asked for assurances they had never needed before. Staff who had once been relaxed around me became careful, watching the way the wind might shift before they committed to trusting what I said. For the first time since taking control, I could see the shape of the opposition clearly. I was not just dealing with an unsteady business. I was standing across from a family willing to use every relationship, rumor, and formal channel they could reach to turn the town's trust against the one person who had finally stopped pretending everything was fine. It did not feel satisfying to see it on paper. It felt cold. The same people who had dismissed my work for years were now willing to suggest that I was reckless, simply because doing so protected the image they had built around themselves. There was no misunderstanding left to clear up, no private conversation that could pull this back into the realm of family disagreement. What they had set in motion lived in files and systems that responded only to evidence. What Sonia laid out on her screen left no room for wishful thinking. Her report mapped every call my father placed after Christmas, every message Bianca sent dressed up as concern, every vague remark that traveled from their phones into other people's inboxes. Taken together, it was not gossip. It was a coordinated effort to turn regulatory attention away from years of neglected obligations and toward the one person who had stepped in with real authority. Victor read through her findings in silence, marking pages as he went. Dates, times, subject lines, routing paths all lined up. The pattern was not subtle and not something that could be dismissed as a misunderstanding. He outlined my options. I could respond narrowly, address only the anonymous complaint, hand regulators every document they asked for, and hope the whisper campaign burned out once the files showed I was cleaning up old problems. Or I could treat what Sonia had uncovered as what it was: deliberate interference in a regulated business and a smear built on half-truths to shield the person who had actually created the risk. The first path promised less visible conflict. The second would put my father and Bianca on record as actors, not bystanders, and close the door on any story in which we were just a tense but intact family. Work at the agency did not pause while I thought about it. Visits still needed scheduling. Nurses still needed clear instructions. Families still expected someone to answer the phone when a relative's condition changed at night. I spent my days in the office, And my evenings at my kitchen table with stacks of files, learning how much damage had accumulated while everyone else insisted things were fine. Some staff members kept their distance, waiting to see whether standing beside me would cost them anything. A few did not. They came with questions they once would have taken to my father, asking what the new reporting systems meant and whether the agency would make it to the end of the year. The people closest to the work had sensed something was wrong long before I took control. Eventually, the decision stopped feeling like a choice. My father and Bianca had already moved the conflict into official channels when they went to regulators and referral partners. Ignoring that would not make it private again. It would only leave me absorbing the consequences of their strategy without using the protections I had in place. Victor drafted a response package for the state. It did more than answer the questions in the letter. It documented late filings from the years before my involvement, the corrective steps already underway, and the fact that the leadership change came through lawful enforcement of a secured agreement, not a grab for power. Sonia's work sat in a separate binder, ready if anyone suggested I had tried to hide the truth. At the same time, Victor prepared notices to my father and to Bianca. They described how their communications had mischaracterized the situation, warned that continued interference could trigger legal action, and demanded that they correct the story they had been spreading to people in a position to hurt the agency. The language did not sound angry. It sounded final. I reviewed every paragraph. I reminded myself I was not creating new consequences. I was refusing to sit still while other people defined me in systems that would remember their words long after they forgot saying them. The moment I signed, the distance between us changed shape again. We were no longer simply relatives with unresolved history. We were parties with opposing interests in a file that would not close on its own. The last step was logistical. Under the note, I had the right to call a meeting to formalize changes in the agency's governance once default had been recorded. Victor scheduled it for late in the winter at a neutral conference room in town, rather than at my parents' house or at the agency. Notices went out on firm letterhead, not as invitations, but as summonses sent to people who held roles, not just titles. When the envelopes were sealed and ready to leave his office, Victor slid them across the desk for a final look. My name appeared in each one, not as an afterthought or a courtesy copy, but as the person in control of what happened next. I had spent most of my life being told I was fortunate just to have a place at their table. Seeing my name attached to decisions that would determine the future of the thing they valued most made it clear that the table had moved. I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady. The next time my family and I sat across from each other, it would not be in a dining room decorated for guests. It would be in a space meant for records and decisions, with no room left for the stories they used to keep themselves comfortable. The meeting took place on a gray afternoon in a rented conference room above a bank downtown. The room was bare except for a table, chairs, and a window over the street. It felt like neutral ground, a place where only what could be proved would matter. Victor had 3 piles of documents set out when I arrived. One defined control of the agency. One responded to regulators. One addressed the contacts my father had reached out to after losing control. What my family had treated as private history now sat organized on paper. My parents walked in first. My mother's posture was rigid, her expression carefully composed. My father looked tired but still carried himself as if tone might outweigh facts. Bianca followed with a tablet and tight jaw. Trevor chose a chair near the door, close to the exit and away from the table's center. Victor opened the meeting by summarizing the secured note. The reports that never arrived, the covenant breaches, and the clause that shifted voting control to me. Then he outlined Sonia's timeline. Calls placed, messages sent, and the way they had stirred concern among regulators and referral sources. He spoke calmly, letting the documents do most of the work. In front of my father lay resolutions removing him from day-to-day authority and, from any title suggesting he still represented the agency. Another page required his signature on a brief statement acknowledging that late filings and weak oversight began under his leadership, and that current management was cooperating fully with oversight. Signing did not undo anything. It simply attached his name to what he had tried to downplay. Bianca's stack was thinner but sharp. She was required to send written clarifications to the same offices that had received her anonymous messages, stating that the change in control came from lawful enforcement of a secured agreement, and that she had no evidence of financial abuse under my leadership. Her earlier notes had left room for doubt. These left none. Trevor signed a short confirmation that he held no ownership interest and had no authority to speak for the agency. On paper, his role barely registered. In reality, it marked the end of his habit of treating other people's damage as safe material for jokes. When the documents reached me, I signed resolutions that made my role formal in every system that mattered. I accepted responsibility for finishing the compliance plan, for ongoing cooperation with oversight, and for speaking for the agency until I chose otherwise. It did not make me more important. It made my position unmistakable. The meeting ended without any closing remarks. Victor gathered the folders and stated that further questions should go through his office. I stood, thanked everyone for coming, and walked out. There were no hugs, no plans for coffee, no attempt to soften what had just been recorded. Whatever we were before, we left that room as parties to the same file, nothing more. Over the next months, the agency studied under stricter systems and open communication with regulators. A regional group approached with an offer that protected staff jobs and clients' care while giving the business better infrastructure. I agreed to sell when those conditions were written into the agreement, stayed through the transition, and then stepped away from daily work there. My parents sold the old house and moved away. I heard about it from someone who still lived on their street. Not from them. Bianca returned to the city and slipped out of the local stories that used to focus on her potential. Trevor found new rooms where people laughed at his lines without knowing what had been behind them. Whatever they said about me happened in places I did not plan to visit. I kept one file box from that chapter: copies of the note, the notices, and the signed statements that turned years of quiet imbalance into a record no one in my family could rewrite. I rarely open it. When I do, I remember that the real break was not the night a plate shattered at Christmas dinner. It was the moment I decided that sharing blood did not require me to live inside someone else's version of me. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is that loyalty without boundaries will drain you dry. You are allowed to protect your work, your name, and your future, even when the pressure to surrender them comes from the people closest to you. Walking away from that is not cruelty. It is the first act of real respect you offer yourself. If you stayed until the end, thank you for listening to my story. I hope it leaves you looking at your own place in your family and asking whether it is one you chose or one you were simply assigned.